Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to a brand new video. Today I'd like to discuss the biases in some of the biblical translation from the Greek to the English. And these biases are mostly theological because when the same word is applied to a different passage, suddenly it is changed as when it is applied to the disciples of Jesus doing an action towards Jesus. The word worship, for example, as when it is used in the NRSV to portray the disciples of Jesus worshiping Jesus. Now, when the same word is used, proskuneio, towards the Magi, um, I'm referring to Matthew here. When the Magi came to Bethlehem, when the Magi came to inquire about Jesus, and when they go to Bethlehem, the NRSV translate the word proskuneio as they render him homage. Okay, the Magi did homage to Jesus. But when the same word is being used to refer to the disciples of Jesus doing proskuneio to Jesus, the translation suddenly changed to worship. Now, I'm drawing materials from David BeDuhn's work here, an exceptional book. I would totally recommend you. And so, let me just read you from page 44 onwards. Okay. But in other passages, translations revert to the King James worship inappropriately. Okay. They do so primarily because the gesture of prostration is directed to Jesus. And in that circumstance, they translate differently under the pressure of theological bias. Now, here is an example. When in Matthew 2, 1, 2, 8, and 11. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of King Herod, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star at its rising, and we have come to do him homage." Okay, and this is what the NAB translate, and this is what majority of the other translation, the translator translate as well, including the NRSV. And so the Magi drop to their knees and prostrate themselves to the baby Jesus. They do so because he is the king their astrological observations had led them to. The majority of the translation, including the NIV, the NASB, the TEV, so on, lapse into language of worship that simply does not apply to this context. Okay? The NIV has the Magi worshipping Jesus, okay, in the sense of in the understanding of modern English, which is not correct. Because in the ancient world, when someone quote unquote worships someone, okay, it is basically to pay him homage, and that is what the NRSV translates as, and that is accurate. So the NRSV is much more accurate than the NIV, because the NIV, in this case, we will see later on that the NRSV do falls into theological biases as well. But in this case, the NRSV is correct because the Magi paid Jesus homage instead of worshipping him. Okay. The Magi were priests of the Zoroastrian faith, which, like Judaism, is monotheistic. In this story, their astrological talents have revealed to them the birth of a new king. Herod and his advisor correctly discerned that this new king, okay, which is not one of Herod's son, must be the Messiah. Okay, this new king must be the Messiah. Jesus must be the Messiah. So Herod feigns willingness to go himself to render homage to the new king. In the Jewish tradition, the Messiah is merely a chosen human being. There is no suggestion that he is a divine being. Okay? The whole episode works with royal images and privileges, and language of worship has no place here. This is what BeDuhn says. We can take the other passage in the Gospel according to Matthew, where proskuneio is used, and see how worship works its way into modern translation. Okay, this is the part whereby the same word is being used, but this time around, it has fallen into theological biases. If the word is used to refer to the actions of a leper, as in, for example, in Matthew 8:2, a local Jewish authority in Matthew 9:18, or woman in Matthew 15:25 and 20:20, most translations stick with the literal meaning of kneeling or bowing. Okay, but when the disciples of Jesus are the actors, suddenly we see worship everywhere. Okay? The same word proskuneio that the NRSV renders as paid homage, the same word is being used here. But when the disciples and Jesus are the actors, suddenly the word proskuneio, which should be translated as homage, okay, paying someone homage, suddenly became worship. And this is what the NRSV says. Okay, and the disciple worshiped Jesus. Okay, those who were in the boat did him homage, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." And this is the translation of the NAB. So the NAB is superior here because the NAB has stick to the correct rendering, correct translation, without any bias, theological bias here. Now this is very disappointing from the NRSV because the NRSV is pretty much the gold standard when it comes to the academic aspect of it, because it was led by Professor Bruce Metzger, okay, the late Professor Bruce Metzger, whom I adore his knowledge very much. Now, this is the explanation of BeDuhn as to why Matthew 14:33 should be translated as homage instead of worship, because it is the same word, proskuneio. Okay? Jesus had just performed the superhuman feat of walking on water. In awe at Jesus' power and in some fear of it, the disciples prostrate themselves in the boat. Within the cultural context of the events, the gestures makes perfect sense. In the ancient world, one bows to power. Most translations choose to import the modern meaning of worship into the passage, apparently because of the recognition by the disciples that they are in the presence of a Son of God. Okay, yes, that's what the Greek says, a Son of God. This title was used of someone especially chosen and protected by God, okay, and bestowed with power by Him, especially a king. The idea was used of Solomon in 2 Samuel 7:14, as well as of Alexander and Augustus in the larger Greco-Roman world. By misreading the words used of Jesus by the disciples, by wrongly reading them in light of the Christian doctrines, okay, about Jesus' divinity as the Son of God with a capital S, most translations add to the text the false idea that the disciples are depicted worshipping Jesus, okay, when in fact, in this particular episode, they merely are reacting to these evident powers in awe. They are not worshipping Jesus. And I've just proven to you here, using the works of BeDuhn, that theological biases have crept into the translator's mind when they translated this passage. I'm referring to the NRSV and a couple of the translations. Now, if you look at the KJV has the word worship here as well. But during the time the KJV was written in the 17th century, and by the way, the modern KJV is rendered to about the year 1700s, okay? So it's about 18th century. During the time the KJV was written, the word worship doesn't mean like worship as in today's understanding of the word, okay, whereby it has some religious connotation to it. The Old English word worship during the time of the King James, it basically means like modern time paying homage to someone, paying homage to a king, like you're bowing down to a king. And so a lot of these translators, when they, especially the NRSV, you'll be surprised that if you read BeDuhn's work, he has countless number of times shows that the NRSV is actually following the KJV, whereby the RSV, the editions before the NRSV, if you read, they say that the KJV has a lot of mistakes in there. But I'm actually quite surprised as well that the NRSV is actually following the KJV when it comes to theological biases in some instance. And so that is actually a surprise. If you read BeDuhn's work, you know that he refers to this many times. Let's take a look at another passage here, Matthew 28:9. Okay? And behold, Jesus met them on their way and greeted them. They approached, embraced his feet, and did him homage. Okay, this is the translation of the NAB. The same word proskuneio is used in this sentence, and the NAB has got it right. Okay, whereas the NASB, the NIV, the NRSV, the DEV, the AB, the LB, the KJV has worship him. Okay, as the word proskuneio here, and that is not the right translation. Okay. And so, again, I will be exploring more of this book in the coming videos. But having read this book, I'm just really surprised. I mean, I'm aware of this before I read this book, that there's a couple of mistranslation on purpose because of theological biases. Now, there's a difference between biases and dishonesty. Okay, I'm not saying that the translators were dishonest. I'm just saying that the translators were unaware that their theological biases have crept in. Now, there are certain passages, if you read this book, there are certain passages whereby the translators are aware, okay, because these are people who has extensive amount of Greek knowledge, and they are aware, but they are mistranslating it on purpose because of their theological bias, and they are aware of this. This will become apparent if you read this book. But for the most part, I'm not saying that the translators were dishonest people. In fact, I believe that they were really, really men of God who believe in Jesus, who loves God, and so they wouldn't resort to these kind of things. And so I'm not faulting anyone, and neither do BeDuhn. He's not faulting anyone. Okay, but just continue here. Let's continue here from Matthew 28:9. The situation in this example is very similar to the previous one. Struck with amazement and fear at seeing Jesus alive, when they thought him dead, the disciples cowered at his feet. Okay? Touching the head of someone's feet while clutching them with the hand is a gesture of total subservience. Okay? The emotions involved in this scene are made plain by the words Jesus uses in the next verse in response to the gesture of his disciples. Do not be afraid. The disciples are not worshipping Jesus. Hence, the NRSV translation is wrong. The disciples are not worshipping Jesus, but throwing themselves to the ground in the presence of someone of apparently superhuman power. Okay? Because the disciples were amazed because they thought that Jesus had died. Okay? By the way, in Matthew and in the Synoptic Gospels, okay, none of the disciples were at the crucifixion scene. Okay? None of the disciples were there. Okay? And so when they have heard that the disciples thought that Jesus had been crucified, okay, according to the Synoptics, okay, and especially in Matthew, when Jesus appeared to the disciples, they were amazed because I thought you have been crucified, you have been dead. Okay. The prostrations made to Jesus fit within the cultural attitudes I discussed at the beginning of this chapter, okay, whereby, as I told you earlier, it is the practice of the Romans and the Greeks, as well as the ancient Egyptians. If you read the Old Testament, the story about Joseph, the brothers prostrating to Joseph, okay? But the brothers, when they prostrated to Joseph, they don't regard Joseph as God. No, they prostrated to Joseph because Joseph saved them from the famine in southern Canaan. Okay? And these are the gestures of respect made to a superior in either the spiritual, social, or political sense. And so, ladies and gentlemen, the NAB get the most points here when it comes to these two passages that I've just discussed. And I'm actually disappointed with the NRSV because it is the gold standard edition, and there's a lot of mistranslations here. When the same word proskuneio is used when it is not referring to Jesus or the disciples, when they are not the actors. The word proskuneio in Greek is translated to as homage. But when the same word is when Jesus and the disciples are the actors, and the same word proskuneio is used, it suddenly become worship. The word proskuneio is not the same meaning as the word worship, as to the modern understanding. Okay, modern English understanding of the word worship. Modern understanding of the English word proskuneio should be rendered as homage. Okay, the KJV rendered the word proskuneio as worship because in the 17th century that word doesn't have the same meaning as modern word worship that we have today. Okay, the word worship in the 17th century English basically means like modern day paying homage to someone. Okay, it's like a gesture of respect, and that is what the disciples of Jesus were doing to Jesus. Okay, the Magi do not worship Jesus. Okay? The Magi came to pay him homage. It's the same word proskuneio here, and the disciples they do not worship Jesus. Okay, they paid him homage, and you have to understand. Okay, that is the language argument here. But even if you look at it from a historical perspective, it makes no sense for the ancient Jews. Okay, Jesus and his disciples were Galilean Jews. It makes no sense for Jews to worship another human being. That's Avodah Zarah. That's idolatry. Okay, that's detested. And so it doesn't fit. Even if you try to put on your theological bias into the reading, number one, the language is against you. And number two, the much bigger context, the historical context is against you. Jews do not worship another human being. That is, it goes away the Ten Commandments, the Shema Yisrael Adonai Elohim, Adonai Echad. And so if you make a Jew worship another human being, that is no longer monotheistic. That is idolatry. That is detested. And Jews would never worship another human being. Not even today. We have no stories of Jews worshiping another human being in the Old Testament. We have the Israelites worshiping the golden calf, worshiping Baal during the time of the minor prophets. But there's no story of a Jew worshiping another human being. That is just, it is not found anywhere. And so this is how we know theological bias has actually crept in into the translator's mind, because these translators they are trying to be objective, okay? But then again, they themselves are committed Christians sometimes, okay? Even though the NRSV community, we do have some people that evangelical not deem as Christian, okay? But anyway, I believe these people were really committed people who commit themselves, who gave their life to exploring manuscripts, different Greek manuscripts, so on and so forth. But unfortunately, they have allowed there are instances whereby they have allowed their theological bias to actually creep into their translation. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I hope this has been clear to you. And my request is stop fiddling with the text. Even if you're translating the text, stop fiddling with the text, because the wider community out there deserve to know the correct way. As you're rendering the Greek into English, it needs to be translated correctly in modern understanding of certain usage of the words. In the next video, I will explore the Gospel of John, the most anticipated Gospel to me. And I actually wanted to know more about the Gospel of John because I heard there's a lot of fiddling with the translation there. And I'm actually surprised as how much fiddling there are, especially in John 1:1. And some of that passage in the text. So I hope you can join me again in my next video. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.